All right, here we got a Fender Hot Rod Deluxe with a very common failure mode. This amp has the complaint that it has a low distorted output, and indeed it did. And there are three common reasons for that. Number one of the output tubes can be bad. So you're only getting all the positive waveform or all the negative waveform. You're not getting the full waveform in the output. In this case, I suspect both tubes are fine. The other thing that can happen, and it mostly happens to the earlier amps where the input jacks, send and return, and foot switch jacks are all the same size. On later amps, the input jacks and foot switch jack were changed to a different style. And it's not the jacks that make the difference. There's a change in production values that correlates to that. But on the earlier amps, the 82K plate resistor in the phase inverter often fails. This one has not. I'm going to change it anyway because they're not reliable. That 82K is not reliable. That's going to get changed, as is that 100K. What is the cause of the problem in this amp are the screen grid resistors, or rather one of them. When I was measuring things, when I had the problem with tubes in place, I had about 450 volts on pin 3, about 450 volts on pin 4 of this tube. I had about 450 volts on pin 3 of this tube, and I had about 80 volts on pin 4 of this tube. So, and that screen grid resistor, which was supposed to be 470 ohms, measured about 5K, and this one measures 470 ohms. So both the screen grid resistors are going to get changed, as are the 82K and the 100K plate resistors in the phase inverter. And I'll show a little bit of that, but it's difficult to film while doing the work because of where I need to have the camera on a tripod, but I'll try to show some of it. All right, I don't know if I'm really gonna be able to show this, but this is the resistor in question, and the leads are bent over the top of the solder pads. And if I just pull down on the resistor from below, it can very easily damage those pads. So what I do, without pulling the entire board, because it's not necessary and it's a lot more labor for the owner to pay for, is I cut this resistor lead right where it joins the body of the resistor. And then I can straighten this lead out from the bottom. So instead of being bent on the bottom, it's straight on the bottom. And then I bend that resistor down, and I can see a dark spot on that resistor body, which I'll show you once I pull it. Anyway, at that point, I can take some fresh solder. The amp is unplugged from the wall and discharged, by the way. That's very important when you're doing this kind of thing, before you go in here. Apply a little bit of fresh solder here and here. And now I can get in here with the pliers from the other side and push this one up. This one should just lift right out. Throw that away. And then I'll push that resistor body up from beneath until I get that hook exposed, that little right angle bit. And I'll just snip that off. And then I will drop the solder roll on the ground, and I'll heat that up and pull the resistor down. This is that failed resistor. You can see it burnt out a chunk. And that chunk that burned was up against the board. So it couldn't be seen when the resistor was in place. The resistor was like this on the bottom of the board, and that burn was up. So you couldn't see it until it was out. But I sure could measure it. So we're gonna put a new one in place, which will have some airflow. We're also gonna use a higher wattage resistor. Let me get the others out. I'm gonna remove the 82K and the 100K in similar fashions. Actually, I'll show you the 82K if I can get the camera positioned right. It's a little bit trickier than the others because I can't do the cut one side trick. So let me get to that and I'll come back and show that. All right, turns out I can't get the snippers under that 100K anyway. So I've got to do the 100K and the 82K both the same way, which is more difficult than doing those screen grids. But you'll be able to see the 100K because it's right up front here. So I'll show this, and I'll do the same thing on the 82K. Again, I want to flow some fresh solder on there. That flux really helps. And now I'm going to use some Tech Spray No Clean number 4 desoldering braid. And there are a lot of different desoldering braids on the market. This one works very well. I'm sure others do too. I can tell you that some, like the one that C Distribution sells, is terrible. Some are terrible. Let me get my numbers to match in my sentences. And I don't like the terrible ones at all. They're no fun. And yes, a desoldering pump, you know, the whole desoldering station can be great, but honestly I find that they clog very easily and it can be a little bit more work. All right, so now that I've got most of that solder out, I heat it back up again. I'm working fast and hot until I can bend that lead up, because I don't want that lead to stick to the board. If that lead sticks to the pad, because there's still some solder on it, it will damage things when I try to push it down. And I see that a lot. Now, this next one's a little bit tricky to do with the camera in place. There's just a little bit of solder right beneath the lead of this resistor and the pad, so I need to make sure that's hot first. But I don't want to get it too hot, because then the pad can lift. It's a balancing act. All right, there we go. All right. It's that right angle on the old leads that will damage that pad if I pull it through with that hook in place. So I straighten that out. This one's got a little funk to it, so I'm going to snip that off. And now I can take this dental pick and I might be able to just push them through. I got a little bit of solder on them. So back with the desoldering braid. Should just fall out at this point once I heat up just a little bit. All right, that's the 100K. The 82Ks in the back here. It's the two that are second from the farthest back. So here and here. And I can't really show that on camera. The 100K, for whatever reason, rarely fails in these. The 82K, for whatever reason, fails all the time. So I like to change them both, and you'll see how I do that in just a minute. Let me get those new resistors ready to go. Okay, we've got new stuff in. We've got new 1 watt 100K and 82K resistors in the plates for the phase inverter. They're mounted here away from any heat from this tube. Better airflow off the board. Same for the two 470 ohm screen grid resistors. I use some 3 watts that are really nice low mass Vichys. Again, elevated off the board away from the radiant heat of the tube. Better airflow. So it's time to put these Mesa 6L6s back and see if there's a problem with these tubes that caused the damage to that screen grid resistor, or whether the screen grid resistor just failed and these tubes are fine. Now it's possible I'll turn this on and this screen grid resistor will fail again because there's something really bad with this, wrong with this tube. If that's the case, we're out a $1 resistor. It's easy to change at this point because it's top mounted. It's also possible that the reason this failed, besides the fact that the ones that Fender use like to fail, is this amp came in with a 5 amp fuse instead of the correct 3 amp fuse. So if everything else is working correctly in this amp with a 3 amp fuse as designed, that fuse should trip if there's a problem sufficient to take out a screen grid resistor. You put in a 5 watt fuse, and all bets are off as to whether anything in the amp stays protected, whether things go up in smoke. Seriously, people, stop using the wrong fuse. It's a $1 mistake that can cost you hundreds of dollars in increased repair bills. All right, so we're going to power this up with a current limiter. And I'm watching to make sure that nothing goes crazy. Got 118 volts coming out of the wall right now. So if anything, it should be biased on the cool side. I'll verify that. they're both heating up. Take out a standby. All right, the first time it comes out of standby, there was a little noise. Subsequently, seems to be okay. Turn off the current limiter. While something still could go, I don't think we're going to have a big light show. So the first thing I'm going to do is see what the screen voltages on both tubes are. Because remember, we had like 85 volts on the screen of this tube at the beginning of this when it was not conducting. So, reading DC at pin 3 of this tube, 456, pin 4, 455 over here, 456, and 455. All right, so we've got both tubes conducting now. It should sound a lot better. Let me see where the bias is at. I would like it to be in the upper 50s right now with the wall voltage a little bit low. It's at 69 millivolts. These are not the original tubes in the amp. I think someone just changed tubes without resetting the bias, which could be another thing. Yeah, that paint was still sealed from the factory on this trim pot. They put paint on it because they're idiots. But anyway, the bias was still factory bias, which would have been a different pair of 6L6s. So, the 5 amp fuse, new pair of tubes in without rebiasing. I'm not really surprised that 2-watt screen grid resistor died. All right, 63 millivolts. We're still at 117 volts on the wall. I'm gonna take this down to about 55 for right now. And once I confirm everything else in the amp is working well, or at least as well as it's supposed to, I will make sure we have 120 volts feeding it and that the bias is back to the factory 60 millivolts. Let me do sorry, I'm tethered to the camera, sorry about that. Let me just do a quick playing test to make sure there's nothing else I'm missing. I'm going to turn the mic level way down for this. Oh yeah, much bright, louder and cleaner than it was. Reverb doesn't sound great, but it sounds like one of these. And I am never a fan of those imminent, specially designed for Fender speakers from that Fender was using and everything in the 90s, but they are working. So I'm going to get out the Variac and make sure the wall voltage feeding this is at 120 and that the bias does not go any hotter than 60 millivolt with 120 volt mains. And at that point, I'll call it done. And we didn't have to pull everything, and this will be a very inexpensive repair, all things told, for the owner. That said, there is still the bench fee. And a lot of this, I think, is caused simply by the fact that they installed tubes without having them biased in a fixed bias adjustable amp, and they had a 5 amp fuse.